Section 22 of the Roman Triumvirates by Charles Merivale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 11. Last effort of the Republicans, the Battle of Philippi. The conduct of the struggle which was now about to open affords an instructive view of the condition of the Roman dominion in the last days of the victorious Commonwealth. We have seen the alacrity with which Cassius, the chief military leader of the Republican party, hastened to throw himself into the remote East and assume the government of the Syrian province. He found himself there at the head of a large army supported by levies from many states and tributary potentates, sustained by the unbounded resources of the wealthiest region of the known world, constituting an independent power but slightly connected in political feeling with Rome itself, and long disused to the restraints of civil law. An army encamped upon a subject territory on which it claimed to live at free quarters. The only rule which it acknowledged was that of its own commander, and this rule it obeyed only so far as he gratified its appetite for plunder and its ordinary contempt of discipline. The great army of the East would follow its leader to any enterprise of conquest among the wealthy regions of Asia, but it did not care to cross the seas and encounter the defenders of the poorer realms of Europe. It preferred the sack of cities and temples to an assignment of lands, and it was dimly conscious that on the soil of Italy its victories could not be crowned by the pillage of Rome, nor even that of Capua or Naples. The veterans of Sulla and Pompeius must be content, when they transferred themselves from the East to the shores of Italy, with the tardy acquisition of forfeited estates and the position of military colonists. Accordingly, the forces of Cassius were all-powerful at Antioch and Ephesus, but they were of little avail for the reconquest of the Western world. Brutus, as we have seen, had been more loath to quit Rome. His patriotic spirit was attached, like that of Cicero, to the home and centre of his nation, and could ill brook the prospect of a long and perhaps a final separation from it. But he, too, as a student of Hellenic culture, was attracted to the East, as far at least as Greece and Athens, by its scholastic associations, and the command which he had secured for himself in Macedonia brought him into direct contact with the men of thought and learning who still congregated from all parts, and especially from Rome herself, in the schools of the Porch, the Garden, and the Academy. Athens was at this time much frequented by the young nobility of Italy. Many who came in their tender years for the purpose of study conceived a special attachment to the place, which weaned them from their own country and made Greece a second home to them. The Romans in Greece constituted a provincial society which owned but a languid allegiance to their native city, and cared perhaps little for their natural connection with it. Among the youthful students of the Athenian University, if we may so entitle it, Brutus enlisted many gallant spirits, such as the young poet Horace, who were fired by the name of liberty, but were more ready to defend themselves in their adopted country against an invader from the west than to make any attempt to recover a footing on the shores which they had virtually abandoned. If we may compare this state of things with an instance from modern history, the Romans at this period in the East were in some marked respects not unlike the people of the southern states of North America. Desirous as they were chiefly of being left alone in the enjoyment of their peculiar advantages, the Romans of the West, like the northerners of the transatlantic continent, would not suffer them to depart, being determined that the empire should not be divided, and that the wealthiest portion of their dominions should not be wrested from the common centre. Doubtless, if there was much patriotism in this determination, there was at the same time much greed of power. But so it was that the government installed at Rome would never consent to the separation of the East from the West. The Caesarians would not suffer such a separation to be effected by the Pompeians, who, for their part, might not be unwilling to acquiesce in it. The followers of the Triumvirs would not concede it to the Republicans, who in their turn would have made little effort to oppose it. And again, at the next turn of fortune to which we shall be directed, we shall find the Triumvir, who is master of the West, inexorable in his resolution to recover the eastern half of the empire from his rival beyond the Aegean. It was, in fact, with the utmost difficulty that at 3 successive crises the unity of the whole unwieldy mass was preserved, and at last so firmly welded together by Augustus and Agrippa that it endured without a rupture, though not without some violent shocks, for nearly 4 centuries. To the last, however, the union was mechanical, so to say, rather than organic. There was no community of interest, no homogeneous feeling, no moral fusion between the East and the West. The 2 hemispheres were maintained in political union only as they had been first compacted by the firm will and strong hand of Rome. The horrible condition to which the civil wars had reduced the long flourishing communities of the East appears in a way in which the Roman chiefs in that quarter were obliged to maintain their armies. As soon as Antonius threatened them with an attack, it became necessary to arm and move the vast hosts which could be easily raised to confront him. The most forcible measures were demanded to supply the means required. This want of means would have prevented any aggressive movement, even had the liberators and those that followed them really cared to carry the war into Italy. But in fact they could not attempt to do so. The legionaries themselves might have refused to engage in a bloody and unprofitable campaign, while the cities of the East offered them abundant gratifications. They found or provoked petty enemies around them, and compelled their chiefs to lead them against the Lycians, the Rhodians, and the Cappadocians, either for pay or plunder. Brutus himself consented to the sack of Xanthus, where the wretched people threw themselves into the flames of their own city. Cassius wantonly attacked the great emporium of Rhodes, mulcted it of 8,500 talents, and enforced the fine by cutting off the heads of 50 of its principal citizens. The whole province of Asia was subjected to the severest proscriptions, of which these are perhaps only specimens. At last, Brutus, hardly less guilty than his colleagues, but more sensitive to the sin and scandal, interfered to restrain such disgraceful cruelties. At Sardis, where the 2 proconsuls met to arrange their plan of operations, he sharply rebuked Cassius for bringing odium on their common cause. But Cassius pleaded his inability to restrain his mercenaries, and Brutus let the matter pass with a few unavailing murmurs. The character of Brutus as a dreamy enthusiast is marked by the venerable legend of a terrible figure that appeared to him at night, and denounced itself as his evil demon, which should present itself to him again at Philippi. It was reported further that Brutus divulged the ominous vision to Cassius the Epicurean, who explained to him the reasoning by which his master in philosophy had demonstrated the vanity of apparitions. Nevertheless, the Stoic idealist continued anxious and dissatisfied. When at last the Republican forces mustered in 42 BC in Macedonia, in the vicinity of Philippi, 100,000 strong, and prepared to encounter the armies, still more numerous, of the Triumvirs, the vision, it is said, recurred. The demon was faithful to his appointment. Never were men's eyes and ears more open to bodings of evil than at this disturbed crisis of human history. The ghosts of Marius and Sulla were supposed to have betokened the renewal of the civil wars. The disaster of Carrhae had been preceded by adverse omens. The battle of Pharsalia had been announced hundreds of miles away at the moment of the impious struggle. Presages of dire significance had been noticed before that fell encounter. Similar intimations, it would seem, could not be wanting to the last fatal scene which was now about to open. Brutus and Cassius posted themselves on two eminences about 12 miles east of Philippi, their left covered by the sea from which they drew their supplies. Antonius placed his camp opposite to that of Cassius. Octavius, on his left, faced the army of Brutus. Cassius, it is said, aware of the enemy's lack of provisions, would have refrained from action. But Brutus, ever fretful and impatient, overruled his wiser counsels. The contest between forces so numerous extended over a wide space and was conducted with little mutual concert between the commanders on either side. Octavius was sick and could not take part in the encounter. More than once in the course of his career did he suffer these untoward hindrances, upon which his enemies did not fail to comment. And now his division was overpowered and precipitately pursued. Brutus believed the battle won, but in the meanwhile Antonius had charged with no less success on the right. Cassius had been driven from his camp, and descrying, when left almost alone, a body of horsemen advancing, had rashly concluded that they were enemies in pursuit, and had thrown himself upon the sword of a freedman. The scouts of Brutus, sent to advertise him of his colleague's advantage, arrived a moment too late. The effect of this blunder was disastrous. Cassius had exercised some control over the soldiers, but Brutus was utterly powerless with them. In vain did he scatter all his treasures among them. They called out the louder for more. In vain did he yield up his prisoners to their cruelty. They grew even more vindictive and bloodthirsty. He was compelled to promise them the plunder of Thessalonica in order to retain them yet a while at his standard. For the Caesarians were reduced to great straits, and the dispersion of their fleet on the same day as the recent battle rendered their advanced position no longer tenable. Both the armies still kept the ground which they had before occupied. 20 days after the first engagement, Brutus was hurried into renewing it. The field was well contested. The instinct of fighting was equally keen on both sides, though on neither was there any real principle at stake, nor any definite object in view. The Roman legionary had become nothing more than a gladiator, bold, expert, and desperate. At the end of the day the Caesarians had broken the ranks of their adversaries, and Octavius assailed them in their camp. Brutus, with 4 legions, kept a position through the night on the neighbouring hills. The next day his men refused to fight, and he could only secure with a few attendants some hours of concealment, after which he terminated his life with a blow of his own sword, when none of them could be induced to do him the last faithful service. The cause of the Republic is said to have perished on the field of Philippi. But to speak truly, the Republic itself had, as we have seen, perished already. The fragments of the broken party which had seemed to gather round it collapsed under this final blow. Many nobles and officers who survived the carnage were captured in the flight or surrendered themselves to the victors, who treated them, strange to say, with distinguished clemency. A remnant was taken off by their own fleet and sought refuge with Sextus at the head of his piratical armament. The Caesarian leaders had shown themselves abler than their opponents. A curse of weakness and barrenness seemed to cling to the murderers of the great dictator, who proved themselves incompetent throughout to originate any bold design, to overcome any difficulties, or to engender even the slightest enthusiasm for the phantom which they followed. Brutus, the best, but perhaps the weakest of the whole crew, died muttering a spiritless verse which rails at virtue as an empty name, and no better than a slave to fortune. If so it be, he should surely have bethought himself thereof before he gratified his spite or vanity by the crime of assassination. Amidst the fury, indeed, of armed factions, it was plain that the government of the world had passed out of the hands of contemplative and philosophical students, if such could have ever hoped to retain it. The strong man was the only man who could rule, and the strong man was more than ever necessary to prevent the world from sinking into anarchy. The true patriot at that moment would have hailed the advent of any ruler vigorous enough to control events, and might have forgiven him an act of usurpation in which lay the only chance of progress, or at least of peace for the future. But the vain idea that the Republic was possible now passed out of men's minds, never again to be revived, except casually and for a moment in the imagination of hot-headed and feeble enthusiasts. There yet remained a short struggle before the personal claims of the foremost captains of the day, but the Commonwealth in general might await with some calmness the issue, which could only be the establishment of a constituted government under the form of monarchy. From the Republic to the Empire might be a moral decline, but it was plainly both natural and inevitable. End of section 22. Section 23 of the Roman Triumvirates by Charles Merivale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 12. Contest between Octavius and Antonius. Battle of Actium. Octavius becomes master of the state. Part 1. The two triumvirs who had conducted the campaign against the common enemy paid little regard to the colleague whom they had left in empty state behind them. After Philippi, they arranged a new division of the provinces, Antonius taking Gaul and Illyricum, Octavius seizing upon Spain and Numidia, and retaining Italy with the Cisalpine in common between the two, while to Lepidus they gave at first no province at all, though at a later period they allowed him to hold the small but important district of Africa. This partition of the provinces seems to have been made in order to allow each chief to gratify his particular followers with subordinate appointments, but the real distribution of power was of a different kind. Octavius returned to Rome and became at once supreme throughout the West, while Antonius preferred to remain in the opposite quarter and reign over its wealthy regions and luxurious cities, which were all placed in subjection to him. While Octavius devoted himself in Italy to the interests of his veterans, his colleague lavished upon himself and his parasites all the spoils he could accumulate. His arrival was everywhere regarded with the utmost dread by cities and potentates, and his favour purchased by flatteries and presents. The clever and artful Cleopatra addressed him, however, in another fashion. The death of her admirer Caesar exposed her to imminent perils at Alexandria, both from within and from without. It was essential to her security to gain the protection of the new ruler of the East. Antonius had seen her in the train of his master, and even then, no doubt, had been struck by her showy fascinations. She had returned to Egypt to secure her throne there. But he now required her to meet him in Cilicia and answer for some imputed intrigues with his enemy Cassius. The queen was confident in her charms, which had already proved so powerful. Instead of appearing herself as a suppliant, she meant to bring him on his knees before her, and she succeeded. Steering for Tarsus for the interview demanded of her, she sailed up the Cydnus in a gilded vessel with purple sails and silver oars to the sound of oriental music. She was seen reclining under a spangled canopy in the garb of Venus, surrounded by Cupids, Graces, and Nereids. Antonius himself had jovially assumed the attributes of Bacchus. The astonished natives hailed the happy conjunction of the two most genial of their divinities. Dazzled by her splendid equipage, he invited her to land and sit at banquet with him. but she haughtily replied that he must come and attend upon herself. The first interview sealed his fate. For the rude triumvir, more of a gladiator than a statesman, Cleopatra discarded the Grecian elegance of manners which had charmed the polished dictator. She sat through his tipsy orgies, laughed at his camp jokes, delighted him with her own saucy sallies, and so maintained the hold which she at once acquired over him, till she first ruined and finally betrayed him. While, however, Antonius was forgetting wife and country, and postponing the war announced against the Parthians for the sake of his new plaything, his brother Lucius had joined with Fulvia in a wanton attack upon Octavius in Italy. Lucius Antonius and Servilius had occupied the consulship for the year 41. Fulvia, daring and ambitious, ruled them both, while the indolent Lepidus fell altogether under eclipse. The return of Octavius surprised and alarmed the guilty confederates. Fulvia was irritated by his dismissal of her daughter Claudia, whom he had but just wedded to satisfy the soldiers. She was mortified also at her husband's desertion, and hoped to tear him away from Alexandria by raising commotions at home. With these views she fomented the discontent of the Italian proprietors, whose lands Octavius had assigned to his veterans, many of whom had already seized their arms to defend themselves, while the veterans themselves were murmuring at the discontent which their victims so naturally manifested. The young triumvir was reduced to great straits. He exerted himself to pacify his followers with fresh confiscations, but his friend Marcus Agrippa shut up Lucius in Perugia, and at last reduced him to capitulation by stress of hunger in 41 BC. It is said that Octavius caused 300 knights and senators to be sacrificed to the shade of his father, but the story of the Aurae Perusii seems little credible, though doubtless his brutal soldiery thirsted for blood, and perhaps he gratified them too largely. We learn, however, that at all events he spared Lucius Antonius, and even gave him an appointment in Spain. Antonius was now roused to exertion, and for a moment he broke away from the toils of his Egyptian paramour. He sent his lieutenant Ventidius to make head against the Parthians, whose hostility, ever ready to kindle in arms, he had already challenged, but he shaped his own course for the west. At Athens he met his consort Fulvia, who upbraided him with his long abandonment of wife and friends. But as he was exerting himself just then to repair his error, the rebuke was at least unseasonable, and his resentment seems to have crushed her spirit and hastened her end, which quickly followed. Relieved from this domestic embarrassment, he led his active squadrons to the coast of the Adriatic. There he made a compact with Sextus Pompeius, and got himself transported across the straits. But the plunder which he seems to have allowed raised the indignation of Italy and Rome, which had learned to regard him as a foreign invader. In Sextus, his base associate, they had long ceased to recognize the son of their ancient favourite. The prince of the pirates had renounced, it was reported, the manners and principles of his countrymen, and affected to be the son of Neptune, and had actually forgotten the Latin language. Accordingly, when Octavius drew his sword to resist this invasion, the sympathies of the people were enlisted warmly on his side as the champion of the Senate, the people, and the national divinities. The soldiers, however, were at this moment stronger than the people, and disposed of their chiefs at their will. They now compelled the two rival leaders to treat. A fresh partition of the empire gave the east to Antonius from the Adriatic to the Euphrates, where he was charged to control the Parthians; the west to Octavius, with the conduct of the war against Sextus. Africa was abandoned to Lepidus. Octavia the sister of the young Caesar, recently left a widow by Marcellus, married the widower Antonius 40 BC. The rivals thus outwardly reunited hastened to Rome together and celebrated their alliance with much hollow rejoicing. The Treaty of Brundisium gave to each of the two contracting parties a new start in power, but it put no check upon their rivalry. The final issue of the long struggle between them, thus carefully balanced, must depend upon personal ability and fortune. The popularity which the younger had already acquired gave him a ground of vantage, but he had 3 arduous tasks before him: to keep Rome and Italy contented, to contend at the same time by sea against the resources and skill of Sextus, and to maintain by constant exercise the courage and ardour of his soldiers. In the first of these undertakings he was ably seconded by Silnius Maecenas, whom he made his chief administrator at home, who soothed rival ambitions in the Senate and the Forum, and pacified the murmurs of the dispossessed proprietors throughout the peninsula. His next endeavour was to come to terms with Sextus, with whom he had connected himself by an opportune marriage with his sister Scribonia. The son of the great Pompeius was now invited to confer with the Triumvirs at Misenum, and the islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica were assigned to him as his share of empire. The allied potentates entertained one another at banquets in a vessel riding at sea, but moored to the land for the equal security of all. And Sextus gallantly declined, though not without an effort, to let his bold lieutenant Minus cut the cable and carry off his rivals with him. But when he refused to restore some places he had taken on the coast of Italy, the western triumvir took up arms against him. In his naval enterprises Octavius was well supported by his friend Agrippa, who constructed the Julian port on the Campanian coast, employed 1 year in equipping a powerful fleet, and after some misadventures effected his enemy's complete overthrow in the sea fight of Naulochus off the coast of Sicily, 37 BC. Sextus fled in confusion to the east and was speedily crushed by Antonius, to whom he vainly looked for protection. Octavius had already repudiated Scribonia and allied himself with the great houses of the Republic by a curious love marriage with Livia, divorced for his sake by her husband Tiberius Claudius Nero. The term prescribed for the triumvirate had expired on the last day of the year 38, but there had been many precedents for the protraction of such irregular powers, and the 3 colleagues were on sufficiently good terms with one another to agree to a renewal of their compact for another period of 5 years in 37 BC. The Senate and the people submitted without an audible murmur to a tyranny which was now more autocratic than ever. Such, it seems, was the result of a meeting of Octavius and Antonius at Tarentum, in which they pretended to maintain a cordial alliance between themselves, while they retained their superiority over their feeble colleague. When Lepidus ventured at last to turn against the ruler of the West, Octavius easily put down so feeble a pretender, and spared the life of a magnate illustrious from his birth and from the dignity which he held of chief pontiff. The younger Caesar had now learnt from the elder the policy of clemency, which he continued to practice to the end of his long career. He was cementing his power and popularity in every direction with a view, no doubt, to the final struggle which he knew to be impending, and his last efforts were directed to keeping his troops in training by campaigns against the barbarians in Dalmatia, where neither spoil nor glory was to be acquired, but which now presented the only field for the arms of a Western imperator. On the other hand, a great sphere was opened to the martial enterprise of the triumvir in the East. Antonius had acted loyally toward his colleague in supplying him with vessels for his contest with Sextus. At the same time, he had required from him a contingent of 20,000 men for the expedition which he was preparing to conduct against the Parthians, Having secured this succour, however, he did not scruple to abandon the sister of Octavius, whom he had so recently espoused as a pledge of constant alliance, and rushed again into the toils of Cleopatra, with whom he indulged in sport and revelry till his armaments were completed. About midsummer of the year B.C. 36, he had assembled 100,000 men on the Euphrates to follow up the partial successes of Ventidius. He had indeed delayed the advance too long, and from the haste with which he now moved, he suffered his machines to fall into the rear, so that when he reached Prospa, 300 miles beyond the Tigris unopposed, he found himself destitute of the means for besieging a strong and well-defended city. An attempt to reduce it by blockade was baffled by the setting in of the cold season in the lofty regions into which he had unwarily plunged. He retreated, and suffered in his retreats hardships almost unparalleled, such as those which attended the flight of Napoleon from Moscow. On his crossing the Araxes, however, the Parthians at length desisted from their pursuit, but still intent on regaining the festive halls of Alexandria, he hurried his weary soldiers along with great distress and loss. He rejoined the queen in Syria, whither she had advanced to meet him, and returned with her defeated but unabashed to the delights of her court in Egypt. So miserable a retreat after so rash an advance could be regarded only as a grave disaster. The base triumvir chose, however, to announce himself as a conqueror. Octavius did not care to contest his claim, and still affected to maintain a cordial understanding with him. Antonius had quitted Alexandria, bent upon another campaign in the east. Octavius, sent with specious compliments by her brother, had gone forward to meet him, bringing with her some picked battalions, well armed and clothed, with other valuable equipments for his army. She hoped even now to win him away from his disgraceful amour with the foreigner. Cleopatra was on watch to baffle her endeavours. The queen soon succeeded in luring her lover back to Egypt. Octavia returned with dignity to Rome, B.C. 35, at last abandoning her reckless lord to the fate which he merited. Antonius grew more and more insensible to the opinions of his countrymen. In the following year, B.C. 34, he made some inroads into Armenia, picked a quarrel with the king Artavasdes, and carried him, loaded with golden chains, to Alexandria. For these successes he awarded himself a triumph, which he celebrated to the disgust of all Roman citizens in the streets of his barbaric capital. End of section 23. Section 24 of the Roman Triumvirates by Charles Merivale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 12. Contest between Octavius and Antonius. Battle of Actium. Octavius becomes master of the state. Part 2. The first months of the year 33 were passed at Alexandria amidst licentious orgies, the rumour of which caused much resentment at Rome, where they were no doubt depicted in the darkest colours. The aim of Cleopatra, it was urged, was to wean the Roman imperator from his national ideas, to make him a foreigner and an Egyptian like herself, to render it impossible for him to show himself again in Rome. This she might perhaps easily effect, but it was more difficult for her to keep the idle voluptuary constantly occupied and constantly amused. Her personal qualities were of the most varied kind, and such as we might suppose would have been lost upon a coarse debauchee like Antonius. She was an admirable singer and musician. She was skilled in many languages and possessed of high intellectual gifts, in addition to the lighter artifices of her sex. She pampered her lover's appetites and stimulated his flagging interest with ingenious surprises and playful ridicule, sending divers, as we read, to fasten a salted fish to the bait of his angling rod, and dissolving in a cup of vinegar a pearl of inestimable value. painters and sculptors were charged to group the illustrious pair together, and the coins of the realm represented the effigies of the two conjointly. The Roman legionary bore the name of Cleopatra on his shield like a Macedonian bodyguard. Masks were represented at court in which the versatile Plancus sank into the character of a stage buffoon and enacted the part of the sea god Glaucus, while the princely lovers arrayed themselves as the native divinities Isis and Osiris. Meanwhile, the Senate had decreed Octavius a legitimate triumph for his successes over the Liburni and the Iapides. He had sustained an honourable wound, and had recovered his reputation for personal courage, on which some slur had been cast by his unseasonable sicknesses. But the youthful hero was not impatient for the celebration of his victory, and deferred the solemnity while he kept the city in intense expectation of a national crisis by upbraiding Antonius with his foreign connection and pointing to him as an enemy to the Commonwealth. Antonius, on his part, had charges also to make against his colleague. These were personal indeed, rather than patriotic. He complained that his just share of the spoils of Lepidus had been withheld from him. But such a complaint met with no response from the Senate and people, and Octavius could well afford to disregard it. The Eastern chief began now to prepare in earnest for a final struggle. He had been collecting troops for another attack upon the Parthians. Toward the end of 33 BC, he directed his forces westward, appointing Ephesus for the rendezvous of the contingents from many provinces and nations which he summoned to his standards. Greeks, Asiatics, and Africans found themselves arrayed around him. Cleopatra appeared herself at the head of the great Egyptian navy. Her galleys were renowned for their size and splendid equipment, and combined with the resources of the eastern Mediterranean to form the largest armament that had ever been launched on its waters, at least since the time of Xerxes. The consuls for the year 32 were Domitius Ahenobarbus and Sosius, both of them adherents of Antonius, who had received their office according to the agreement then still existing between him and his colleague. But this advantage was balanced by the defection of some of his chief supporters. Plancus, who had consented to degrade himself for the amusement of his patron's court, now reappeared in the Senate and denounced his treachery and frivolity. This man betrayed to Octavius the testament of the renegade imperator, which he had been charged to deposit with the Vestal virgins, and in which, it seems, Antonius had acknowledged the validity of Caesar's odious union with the foreigner, had declared her child Caesario to be the dictator's legitimate son, had confirmed his own donations of crowns and provinces to his bastards, and finally had directed that his own body should be entombed by the side of Cleopatra's in the mausoleum of the Ptolemies. None could now doubt the rumours which prevailed, that he had pledged the queen and his cups to remove the government of the world to Alexandria and prostrate the gods of the capital before the monstrous deities of the Nile. Octavius was at once greeted as the true champion of the nation, the maintainer of its principles and its faith. The consuls hurried away from the city, in which they found themselves ill at ease. Octavius, still moderate, still politic, refrained from declaring the impious chief a public enemy. He was content with proclaiming war against Egypt. The second term of the Triumvirate had expired, and he did not renew it. He directed the Senate to annul the appointment of Antonius to the next consulship, and assumed it himself with Messala for the year 31. Even the handful of nobles who repaired at this crisis to the side of Antonius now urged him to dismiss Cleopatra and reduce the impending struggle to a personal contest with his rival. He replied by formally divorcing his legitimate consort, and thus breaking the last legal tie that bound him to his country. He had now assembled 100,000 foot and 12,000 horse. The kings of Mauretania, of Commagene, Pamphylogonia, and Cilicia followed his banners. His fleet counted 500 large warships, some of them with 8 or even 10 banks of oars. The forces of Octavius were somewhat inferior by land. His vessels were much fewer in number, but of a lighter and more manageable class. Antonius adopted Patrae and the Peloponnesus for his winter quarters, while he disposed of his vast armies for their better support along the coast of Epirus. But his navy suffered from sickness, and Agrippa contrived to throw the Caesarian forces across the Adriatic. From that moment defection commenced. Domitius was the first to abscond. Many princes of Asia followed his example. Antonius fancied himself surrounded by traitors. He distrusted even Cleopatra, and required her to taste in his company all the viands that were set before him. Some partial engagements first took place at sea, in which Agrippa's skill gained the advantage. Antonius was quickly discouraged. He would have withdrawn his land forces further into the interior, but Cleopatra, fearing for her own retreat, dissuaded him from this project. A strange story is related that he sent Octavius a challenge to single combat, which was scornfully rejected. Thereupon he made preparations for flight, and determined to lead a general attack on the Caesarian fleet, with no hope of victory, but merely to gain an opportunity of escape. For several days the agitation of the sea would not allow either armament to move. At last, on September 2nd, the wind fell, the waters became smoother, and with the rise of a gentle breeze the Antonian galleys made for the open sea. Their huge hulks were ill adapted for manoeuvring, but they hurled massive stones from their wooden towers, and thrust forth ponderous irons to grapple the unwary assailant. The light triremes of Octavius were, on the other hand, both dexterous and agile. Their well-trained rowers bore up or backed with rapidity, and swept away the banks of the enemy's oars under cover of a shower of arrows. The combat was animated but indecisive. But while the Antonian barges rolled heavily on the water, incapable of attacking their puny assailants, suddenly Cleopatra's galley moored in the rear, hoisted sail, and threaded the maze of combatants, followed by the Egyptian squadron of 60 vessels. Antonius was not unprepared for the signal. He leapt into a boat and hastened after her. The rage and shame of his adherents filled them with despair. Many tore down their turrets and threw them into the sea to lighten their decks for flight. Yet many continued to fight recklessly or blindly. Too lofty to be scaled, too powerful to be run down, their huge vessels were at last destroyed by fire. 300 of them had been captured, few probably escaped. The land forces refused for a time to believe in their leader's ignominy, and might perhaps have still maintained their position, but when their commander Canidius abandoned the camp for the Caesarian quarters, they offered no further resistance. So complete a victory as that of Actium has seldom been so easily gained. The accounts we have received of the conduct of the miserable Antonius come no doubt from the side of the victors, but it is impossible to suppose that he lost so great a fleet and army so utterly, except by his own misconduct. Octavius might now feel himself secure, and proceed to establish his triumphant position with full deliberation. He sent Maecenas and Agrippa to Italy, the one to govern the city, the other to control the legions in his absence, while he advanced in person into Greece and thence into Asia, receiving on all sides the greetings of the people and making arrangements for their future government. He returned to Italy in the course of the ensuing winter. Knights and senators, together with multitudes of citizens, came as far as Brundisium to meet him. He listened graciously to the complaints of his veterans, sold his own effects and those of his nearest friends to satisfy them, planted new colonies in the lands of conquered cities, and finally promised an ample donative from the anticipated spoil of Egypt. With the beginning of spring, B.C. 30, he was again in a condition to follow the track of the fugitives. To them 6 months' respite had been granted. We can hardly suppose that the court of Alexandria, even though swayed by the vigorous arms of a great Roman imperator, could present any effective resistance to the whole power of Rome, if once brought to bear against it. Yet Egypt abounded in wealth. She was the emporium of the immense trade which converged thither from both the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. She was one of the principal granaries of Rome and Italy. Though her native population was feeble and unwarlike, she could purchase the swords of the mercenary soldiers who swarmed on every side. Her rulers were skilled in statecraft, and could intrigue at least with all the discontented rulers and peoples, to whom their enforced submission to the great republic was ever odious. We cannot but think that chiefs of real spirit and resolution might have defended themselves under such circumstances against any power that could be arrayed against them. But it was not so. Antonius and Cleopatra traversed the sea in the same vessel. The Roman landed at Paraetonium to secure the small garrison of the place. The Egyptian entered the port of Alexandria with laurels displayed on her deck, for fear of the tumult which the sudden news of her disaster might awaken. There was neither love nor obedience awaiting her in her own capital. Her power rested on no popular foundation, and of this she, as the descendant of a long line of foreign potentates, was no doubt well aware. Antonius himself was repulsed by a handful of Roman soldiers. The only relief for the despair which he began to entertain might be derived from the devotion, fruitless though it was, of a small band of gladiators who made their way through Asia and Syria to join him, and only yielded to Herod, king of Judea, on the false assurance of their patron's death. Then it was that Cleopatra proposed to flee into Arabia, but her vessels were destroyed by the wild inhabitants of the Red Sea coast. Again the wretched pair contemplated an attempt to escape into Spain. Any quarter of the world seemed to them in their cowardly distress securer than their own dominion. When this scheme too was relinquished, Antonius shut himself up in a solitary tower. Cleopatra made show at least of greater resolution, and presented herself to the people in military costume, as if to animate them to resistance. But in private she abandoned herself, together with her lover, who had crept back to her embraces, to her accustomed orgies, while she made experiments with various kinds of poison, and ascertained, it was said, that the most painless of deaths is that which follows on the bite of the asp. The two helpless associates were not even true to one another. Each began to negotiate separately with the victor. To Antonius no answer was vouchsafed. Better hopes were held out to Cleopatra if she would turn against her paramour. Octavius, ever cautious, even when the game was in his hands, and anxious to secure her person to embellish his future triumphs, continued to amuse and deceive her. He allowed his agents to remind her of his youth and of her own well-tried fascinations. When Antonius gained a trifling but useless advantage over the first battalion which the enemy threw on his shore, she deemed the time come to separate her interests from his, and treacherously induced his ships to abandon him. At the same moment, and perhaps through the same treachery, the last of his cohorts deserted him. The queen had shut herself up in a tower constructed for her mausoleum. Fearing the violence of the man she had ruined, she caused him to be assured that she had killed herself. With the infatuated renegade all was now over, and he determined himself to die. With the aid of his freedman Eros, he gave himself a mortal wound, but while yet living he learnt that she too still survived, and causing himself thereupon to be brought to the foot of her tower, he was drawn up to her by her women, and there expired in her arms. Octavius at the same moment entered Alexandria. He charged an officer to secure the queen alive. Cleopatra refused him admittance. When he scaled her chamber, she pretended to stab herself. He seized her arm and assured her of his master's kindness. At length she suffered herself to be removed to the palace, and there awaited an interview with the conqueror. Prepared to exert all her charms upon him, with the bust of Caesar presented to his view. But the attempted seduction proved fruitless, as might have been expected. Octavius kept, indeed, his eyes on the ground, but he never lost his coolness and self-possession. While she was flattering and caressing him, he coldly demanded a list of her treasures, which he required to be surrendered. But for herself he bade her be of good courage and trust to his magnanimity. Cleopatra was soon made to understand that though her life should be spared, she would be removed to Rome and exhibited in the conqueror's triumph. She resolved to die. Retiring to the mausoleum where lay the body of Antonius, she crowned his bier with flowers, and was found the next morning dead on her couch, her 2 women weeping beside her. "Is this well?" exclaimed the dismayed emissary of Octavius. "It is well," replied Charmian, "and worthy of the daughter of kings." The manner of her death was never certainly known. At the triumph, thus deprived of the ornament of her living presence, her image was carried on a bier, the arms encircled by 2 serpents, which served to confirm the rumour that she had perished by the bite of an asp, brought to her, as was reported, in a basket of figs. The child of the foreign woman by Julius Caesar was cruelly put to death, to appease the exaggerated or pretended sentiments of Roman nationality, while the offspring of Antonius and the matron Fulvia was suffered to survive and retain his birthright as a citizen. The dynasty of the Ptolemies ceased to reign. The Macedonian conquest was replaced by the Roman, and Egypt was finally reduced to the condition of a province. Octavius was master of the Commonwealth and became the founder of an empire. Between these 2 results there is a great difference to be noted. Marius and Pompeius had both been virtually masters of the Commonwealth before Octavius. Sulla and Caesar had been so actually, and had been confirmed as such by legal appointment. The first triumvirate had dominated over it, the second had extorted from it supreme authority, and had demanded a renewal of its powers as long as its members could keep on terms of alliance one with another. The Commonwealth had fallen under a succession of masters, and if from time to time it recovered a momentary independence, it was only by a fitful struggle, which showed its own intrinsic weakness and inability to rule itself. Rome might have fallen again and again into the hands of other masters, each wresting the sovereignty from his predecessor by force, and each yielding it in turn to a stronger successor. The body politic might have been torn in pieces, and either have been split into a number of states or perished in anarchy altogether. The barbarians of the Rhine and the Danube might have arrived 3 centuries before their time, but it was not to be so. Octavius founded an empire. Every age may produce many men who can destroy an empire, but rarely is the man born who can found one. It was the singular fortune of Rome, rather let us say it was the special providence which presides over all human history, that presented mankind at this most critical epoch of their career with the individual man who could actually perform the work required for the maintenance of the ancient civilization. In the overthrow of the so-called Roman liberty there is doubtless something to regret, but surely not much, for Roman liberty was little else than general servitude. In the violence and selfishness by which this overthrow was effected, there is much which the moralist may be called upon to denounce, though in view of the vastness of the issue involved, the historian will hardly pause to weigh nicely in the balance the crimes of one or other of the actors in the shifting scenes before him. The defects and sins of the empire which followed may be estimated by those who undertake specially to describe it, but the moral to be drawn from the epoch before us is simply this, that Rome had reached the moment when she could no longer retain her political liberty, and that the struggles of her triumvirates could only end either in anarchy or in monarchy. End of section 24. Read by Pamela Nagami in Encino, California, September 2021. End of the Roman Triumvirates, by Charles Merivale.